Welcome to the webinar, everybody. My name is Archana Sridhar. I'm a Senior Product Manager with AWS Config. My co-speaker today is Rodney Bozzo, Specialist Solution Architect Manager for AWS Management and Governance. Together, we are excited to be talking about configuration, compliance, and audit using AWS Config and AWS CloudTrail. Setting some context before we start. By configuration, we refer to the functional arrangement of resources, including their settings, such as a user account having multi-factor authentication. By compliance, we refer to how resources conform to requirements, either internal policies or external regulatory compliance programs. By auditing, we are referring to what provides you visibility into your AWS account activity, granting the ability to perform some kind of a review. With that, here's what we'd like to cover today. We'll start with the basics of AWS Config, talk about how configuration and compliance works with AWS Config, and then we'll move on to the basics of AWS CloudTrail and how auditing can be simplified using CloudTrail. We will have demos along the way and leave some time in the end for Q&A. Let's talk about a couple of fundamental concepts before diving into what AWS Config does. So first of all, inventory management system. It maintains a real-time inventory of resources and their current and historical configuration. It helps answer questions such as what resources currently exist in my account, what are their latest configurations, and what relationships exist between these resources, and any configuration changes that have occurred in the past specific period of time, let's say a week, or which resources in my accounts have encryption disabled. All of these are extremely valuable information when you're investigating an operational issue or a security breach. On the other hand, configuration compliance management is about verifying that your resource configuration complies with baseline policies or best practices. These could be policies designed to meet regulatory requirements such as HIPAA or PCI, or they could be internal policies defined by your own InfoSec team. Together, these two functions support governance initiatives and help simplify compliance by providing you accurate and up-to-the-minute information to assist with decision-making. Traditionally, these functions were supported by a configuration management database or a CMDB. The challenge is you can't use a traditional CMDB to manage your resources in the cloud, and you need some specific capabilities that are very unique to the cloud. The resources are dynamic in the cloud, so you've got auto-scaling and spot instances type of resources which come and go multiple times in a day. And you can't really just rely on nightly jobs to discover these new resources in your account. You need a real-time discovery of new resources, so your incident and change management processes have up-to-date and accurate information at any given time. You also need to track configuration changes for your critical workloads and get alerted instantly. Your CMDB needs to be accessible via APIs so you can integrate with other tools, and you need to put mechanisms in place real-time against your baseline policies so you can avoid going out of compliance at any given time. In short, you need a cloud-aware CMDB. And this is where AWS Config comes in handy. AWS Config is a native tool within AWS, integrated with other services such as CloudFormation, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and AWS organizations. From an inventory management standpoint, it discovers resources automatically in real time without using an agent. It tracks configuration changes to those resources and maintains a history for up to 7 years by default, so you can use it for operational troubleshooting purposes. From a configuration compliance perspective, Config gives you the ability to define policies with config rules, and actually deploy them at scale using conformance packs and evaluate resources against the set policies either periodically or based on specific configuration change. It alerts you in real time about any configuration and compliance changes so that you can take corrective actions as required. It is integrated with AWS organizations, so you can view your resource inventory and compliance status of all your resources across your entire organizations and multiple regions as necessary. You can easily integrate with your own ITSM and CMDB tools such as ServiceNow, so you can continue to make use of your existing investments and enable incident and change management workflows wherever necessary. Config keeps track of the compliance history, so you know when your resources went in and out of compliance. It can be used for operational governance. For example, you can evaluate your CI/CD pipeline configuration to ensure auto rollback is enabled on the pipeline. Or you can use it for cost optimization by identifying resources that are unused and then terminating them. Config is also commonly used for security intelligence. For example, reviewing the changes that occurred after a security breach or identifying resources that are not encrypted. So config can serve as your CMDB or cloud CMDB or continuous configuration auditor for the cloud. Let's run through a quick demo to see some best practices around how AWS Config can be set up. So let's get started. First thing is to enable config recording for all resource types supported in the region. Just making sure that you have a comprehensive configuration audit in place for all of the 60 plus AWS resource types config supports at this time. As and when config supports new resource types, it would automatically be recorded by way of this setting. Now, include recording of global resources only in one region, just so you don't get redundant copies of these in multiple regions. This helps control your config specific costs. You can selectively choose to record specific types of resources, but that's not the recommended best practice, just a possibility with the setup. I'm showing how to set this all up in one account, but the industry best practice recommended by Center of Internet Security or CIS is that configuration change recording should be enabled across all accounts and regions, and you can use CloudFormation stack sets to do that. Next, we ensure that you have a secure S3 bucket to collect the configuration history and the snapshot files. This bucket shouldn't be publicly readable or writable. So for this, you can follow the S3 security best practices and either turn on a couple of config rules that identify buckets that are publicly accessible, or turn on the S3 best practices conformance pack, and we'll go through that a little bit later. Config can stream all configuration and compliance change notifications to SNS topics. You can use a central topic to gather notification from multiple accounts in your enterprise in case they need to be processed by a central IT team. So that's definitely a possibility. Another key thing is to set the appropriate permissions for the IAM role assigned to config. Config assumes the role that you assign to it to write to the S3 bucket, publish to SNS topic, and to make API requests to get configuration details for your resources. When you use the console to create or update an IAM role, config automatically attaches the required permissions for you. But if you're using the CLI to set up config, or you're updating an existing IAM role, you must manually update the policy to allow config to access your S3 bucket, publish to SNS topic, and get configuration details, etc. So let's get that done. Okay, so that is the config recording or the configuration changes recording setup. We now move on to config rules. Again, this is optional, but this is where you would look for the S3 bucket specific rules that I mentioned before, so we can search for them. so the public read and write prohibited type of rules. You can enable these too. You can also enable all of the rules that are available, for example, in the given region, and then whether they are S3 bucket specific or otherwise. And then you can kind of set them up in one shot. It shows all the settings we selected, and this is the dashboard where you get to see your resources. Let me quickly refresh. Okay, so here you can see the inventory, the resources that are in this particular account, and a summary of compliance as evaluated by the config rules that were selected. Now you can go into a single rule, get into a resource, and look at the resource level details. What config provides you is the configuration timeline as well as the compliance timeline. So this is the configuration timeline that shows when it was created, when something changed. And the compliance timeline basically shows you what rules went in and out of compliance for this particular, or with respect to what rules this particular resource went in and out of compliance. You can add a rule. Let's talk about adding a rule and then associated remediation. Let's pick a specific config rule and look for how to configure that in your account. As I mentioned before, there are configuration change triggered rules and periodic triggered rules. This is a configuration change triggered rule. I'm going to look to add a remediation action to this particular rule. The key thing about remediation action is, do you want it to be automatically remediating or manual remediation? I'm going to select auto remediation in this case. I want this remediation to be based on bucket name. So when there is a bucket name level non-compliant resource recognized, I want this remediation to run. I'm going to put a role and save this remediation action. And I'm going to look for that rule in my dashboard here. Yeah, that's still evaluating. So that's a summary how you set up a configuration recording, a rule, and a remediation. These are all the basic constructs that will enable you to build additional use cases and capabilities in config. All right, let's talk about some additional features in AWS Config that help you with configuration and compliance management. We talked about setting up config rules, about managed rules. These are out-of-the-box rules that are available in every region that you can easily add immediately to your account. Now, you can also create custom rules and set them up to be invoked based on changes in resources or periodically, just like the managed rules. You can create custom remediation through automation documents with SSM automation documents and associate them with managed rules or custom rules. Now, automatic remediation, a couple of additional things to add in there. We showed an example earlier in the demo. You can associate a remediation action to automatically fix specific non-compliance in your account for specific resources. You can also set up the remediation actions as things to send notifications like an SNS notification, or creating a ticket like in a Jira ticket or something like that. So it doesn't have to directly be about remediating a specific resource, but setting off a set of events that will eventually get your rule into a compliance mode. Now let's talk about conformance packs. These allow you to package a collection of config rules and remediations into a single entity, which can be easily deployed across an entire organization with a single click. It's meant to simplify the deployment of rules and remediation across multiple accounts and simplifies compliance reporting, because compliance summaries will be presented at a pack level rather than at the individual rule level. Another benefit of conformance packs is immutability. So if an organization master account deploys a pack across its member accounts, the rules within the pack cannot be modified or deleted by the member accounts, giving you as the central admin control over which rules shouldn't be moved around or changed or deleted in the individual member accounts. Config also allows you to record changes in non-AWS resources such as Active Directory, GitHub repositories, or SaaS tools such as Datadog. So that's the custom resources recording capability. Let's do a quick demo of how to set up conformance packs from the dashboard here. All right, from the dashboard, we are going to go ahead and deploy conformance pack from here. And as you can see, there are multiple different ways you can do it using the sample templates or creating your own template. So we're looking at the sample templates that are offered out of the box. Basically, there are some that are just best practices and others that are with reference to compliance regimes. We're going to pick up the NIST CSF one as an example and go ahead and take a look at the documentation here. It provides full details on what kinds of rules conform to which control ID in terms of the compliance regime itself. And in addition to that, you can also see the full template, which you can actually copy, update the parameters, add more rules, add remediations, and everything that is necessary to make it your own. Now, in here, I'm going to give it a custom name and then select an S3 bucket. Now this is the more easier way to deploy it, and then parameters are optional for this one, but you can go ahead and change them if you want to customize the conformance pack. Now it deploys on your console, and this is again at an individual account level. Once the deployment is completed, you can actually click into it and go ahead and see all of the individual rules that were deployed as part of this conformance pack. This particular one doesn't have any remediation actions associated with it, but again, through the template, you should be able to add remediation action and set these up as well. So as you can see, when you're deploying it across multiple accounts and regions, this becomes an easy option. I'm showing a single account, single region here, but the option to deploy a number of rules and associated remediations together is quite powerful. Using the CLI, you can actually delegate an administrator account from the master account and use that delegated admin to deploy conformance packs in your organization. Now, this is a new capability and will help you deploy from a non-master account across the member accounts. Again, all of these are different ways to scale the utilization of config rules and remediations in the form of conformance packs that can be deployed across your accounts and regions. So until now, we talked about inventory management and configuration compliance management with the various AWS Config capabilities. Let's talk a little bit about how we can utilize these at scale. When you need to monitor inventory and configuration compliance across multiple accounts in multiple AWS regions where these accounts have operations, you need the ability to create views, probably multiple views, that can give you specific perspective of your infrastructure for the specific use case that you're looking for. Here's where the multi-account, multi-region data aggregation capability comes in handy. You can set up an aggregator that can pull resource configuration and compliance data from selected accounts in your organization or across all accounts in your organization. Based on the accounts you selected, the data aggregated view provides resource inventory and compliance data, making it simpler for you to visualize and monitor the overall state of your organization. Let's now move on to another one of AWS Config's capabilities called Advanced Queries. It allows you to query the configuration of a resource based on its properties. That's really valuable because now you have a single endpoint to query exactly what you need without performing AWS service-specific API calls. It uses a subset of a SQL Select as the query language. We've provided some sample queries out of the box in order to get you started quickly. And the best part is that Advanced Query is available at no additional cost for AWS Config customers and is available in all AWS public regions and in GovCloud. You can use Advanced Query for inventory management, for cost management by searching for EBS volumes that are not attached to EC2 instances and similar use cases. You can use it for change management to understand the impact of a change by looking at the resource relationships, or you can use it for security management, searching for resources that are publicly accessible. Let's now take a quick look at how to set up Config Aggregator and use advanced queries with it. All right. Time to create an aggregator. So first of all, we're going to give this a name. There are two ways to create an aggregator. One by adding individual account IDs or from the organization master. So that way all accounts will bring in aggregate data into the aggregator, and any future accounts will also add their data to the account, the aggregator by default. So adding the organization here, I need to choose a role, create a role, so I give access to all of the individual accounts to bring in the data necessary. Now, you can choose the regions from which to bring in the data into the aggregator. In some use cases, it might be beneficial to create multiple aggregators with different region combinations for different geographical regions, or you can select all regions, and there is an option here to say record future regions as well. So in this case, we are going to select all regions where the data can be brought in from, and then include future AWS regions. So we're going to go ahead and make this choice and create the aggregator. It takes a while for the aggregator to bring in the data from the different regions and for that to populate into the dashboard here. So let's take a look at the one that we created, which is the demo aggregator. Yeah, while it brings data, what we can do is to look at an existing aggregator. Now this one is bringing data from specific accounts. So let's go ahead and see the details here. So at a glance, the dashboard shows you the resource inventory and the compliance status of the rules and the top non-compliant rules and related information. You can go into the individual sections. So for example, if you go into the rules section within the aggregators, and then you can look up this compliance state of all the different rules and across different regions, and then just the resources themselves, you can see at a glance what resources are present for this particular aggregator across all of these accounts. So this is a really powerful way to have a single view across your accounts and regions, or across multiple accounts in your organization, by creating different types of aggregators. We now come back here to take a look at the demo aggregator that we just created, and see that the resources and the compliance states from across the accounts are getting populated. Now, advanced queries, we talked about having some sample queries. So let's take a look at a couple of quick samples. This one right here is giving you a count of the EC2 instances. You can select the aggregator that you created and run it just to see across your organization what are the different sizes of EC2 instances that are present. You can look at unused EBS volumes because they usually are associated with costs, so you just want to keep an eye on them. Looking at these across the aggregator will give you a full view. And one of the capabilities that Aggregator gives you is to be able to export this data either as a CSV or into JSON format. In this case, I'm going to export it as a CSV just to kind of give you a quick demo. Yeah, and you can use this as a report to, kind of consolidate and take next steps as necessary. You can search for some specific rules, such as some specific queries. In this situation, let's start looking at something that can help with compliance management. So non-compliant resources for a single config rule. So for required tags in my aggregator, I want to see what is the distribution in terms of compliance and non-compliance, and with different resource types as well. The format here gives you the ability to play around a little bit and create your own structure for what will add value to you. So that is the advanced query capability at a glance.
Thank you, Archana. Now that we have covered how configuration and compliance can be managed within AWS using AWS Config, let's talk about CloudTrail and its auditing capabilities. Now, for this specific section of the webinar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some concepts, some components that are important to CloudTrail, and then I'm going to switch to the demo to kind of connect the dots of how things work. First of all, CloudTrail is an AWS service that enables governance, compliance, and operational and risk auditing of your AWS account. You can use this information recorded in CloudTrail logs and stay on top of the activity on actions taken by a user, a role, or an AWS service. Each action is recorded as an event in CloudTrail, including actions taken in the AWS Management Console and with the AWS CLI, the AWS Software Development Kit, and also APIs. Now, AWS CloudTrail provides audit logs for AWS. From the topics that we're here to talk about, configuration, compliance, and audit, CloudTrail really gives the ability to perform the auditing within your AWS resources. We are going to see how you can do it a few different ways, but let's jump right on it. CloudTrail is enabled on your AWS account when you create it. When activity occurs in your account, that activity is recorded in a CloudTrail event. You can easily view events in your CloudTrail console by going to Event History. Event History allows you to view, search, and download the past 90 days of activity in your AWS account. In addition, you can create a CloudTrail trail to archive, analyze, and respond to changes in your AWS resources. A trail is a configuration that enables delivery of events to an Amazon S3 bucket that you specify. You can also deliver and analyze events in a trail with Amazon CloudWatch logs and also Amazon CloudWatch events. And you can create a trail within the AWS console using the AWS CLI and also using the CloudTrail APIs. Now, CloudTrail captures actions made directly by a user or on behalf of a user by an AWS service. For example, an AWS CloudFormation create stack call can result in additional API calls to Amazon EC2, Amazon RDS, or any other services required by that CloudFormation template. Now, this behavior is normal and expected, and you can identify if the action was taken by an AWS service with the invoked by field in the CloudTrail event. CloudWatch is a web service that collects and tracks metrics to monitor your resources and the applications that run on AWS. CloudWatch Logs is a feature of CloudWatch that you can use to monitor log data. Integration with CloudWatch Logs enables CloudTrail to send events containing API activity in your account to CloudWatch Logs log group. CloudTrail events that are sent to CloudWatch Logs can trigger alarms according to the metrics filters that you define. You can optionally configure CloudWatch alarms to send notifications or make changes to the resources that are monitoring based on log stream events that your metric filters extract. Also, CloudWatch Events is an AWS service that delivers a near real-time stream of system events that describe changes in your resources. In CloudWatch Events, you can create rules that trigger on any event recorded by CloudTrail. Now, once you have all this data stored in an S3 bucket, or once you have that data being sent to CloudWatch, now how do you audit that data? We will learn one of the ways in which you can do that during today's demo. Now, how does CloudTrail help customers? What are CloudTrail's benefits? Well, here are a few. Simplified compliance. CloudTrail provides the ability to simplify your compliance audits by automatically recording and storing event logs for actions made within your AWS account. Integration with CloudWatch logs provides a convenient way to search through the log data, identify out-of-compliance events, accelerate incident investigations, and expedite responses to auditor requests. Also, visibility into user and resource activity. CloudTrail increases visibility into your user and resource activity by recording AWS Management Console actions and API calls. You can identify which users and accounts called AWS, the IP addresses from which the calls were made, and also when the calls occurred. Security analysis and troubleshooting. With CloudTrail, you can discover and troubleshoot security and operational issues by capturing a comprehensive history of changes that occurred in your AWS account within a specified period of time. CloudTrail increases visibility into your user and resource activity by recording AWS Management Console actions and API calls. You can identify which users and accounts called AWS, the source IP addresses from which the calls were made, and when the calls occurred. Also, security analysis and troubleshooting. With CloudTrail, you can discover and troubleshoot security and operational issues by capturing a comprehensive history of changes that occurred in your AWS account within a specified period of time. Now, if you were to correlate the data that is captured by Config with the event data that is captured by CloudTrail, being able to reduce the mean time to recovery for an operational issue can be expedited or reduced significantly. Also, security automation. AWS CloudTrail allows you to track and automatically respond to account activity threatening the security of your AWS resources. With Amazon CloudWatch events and the integration that CloudTrail has with CloudWatch events, you can define workflows that execute when an event that can result in a security vulnerability is detected. For example, you can create a workflow to add a specific policy to an S3 bucket when CloudTrail logs an API call that makes that bucket public. Okay, so now that you understand what is happening in your environment, who is using my resource, did they modify that resource, when did they access that resource, why do you care? Now here are some common CloudTrail use cases and some ways in which CloudTrail can help you solve some of your problems. First one is compliance aid. CloudTrail makes it easy to manage compliance with internal policies and regulatory standards by providing a history of activity in your AWS account. Security analysis. You can perform security analysis and detect user behavior patterns by ingesting CloudTrail events into your log management and analytic solutions. Data exfiltration. You can detect data exfiltration by collecting activity data on S3 objects through object-level API events recorded in CloudTrail. After the activity data is collected, you can use other services like CloudWatch Events, AWS Lambda to trigger a response procedure. Also, operational issue troubleshooting. You can troubleshoot operational issues by leveraging the AWS API call history produced by CloudTrail. For example, you can quickly identify the most recent change made to a resource in your environment, including creation, modification, and deletion of an AWS resource. And lastly, unusual activity detection. You can detect unusual activity in your AWS accounts by enabling CloudTrail Insights. For example, you can quickly alert and act on operational issues such as erroneous spikes in resource provisioning or services hitting rate limits. Now that we've talked about the benefits of CloudTrail, now that we've talked about some of the use cases in which you can leverage CloudTrail, let's talk about some important components. The first one is audit trails. Now, the audit trail allows you to define the events that get captured by the trail. This means whether you want to capture management events, data events, or also insight events, something that you can configure at this level. Now, we'll talk about each one of those event types in more detail during the demo. Also, if you wanted to standardize across your entire organization, something that you can define, there's a feature called organizational trail that allows you to set that standardization. Also, if you wanted to define whether a specific type of event, whether it's a write event or if it's a data event for an S3 bucket that may be within the scope of a specific compliance program, that's something that you can define. Now, the recommendation is to create one audit trail that logs all of the events across all of your regions. Best practice says that if you're using this CloudTrail trail for security audit functionality, then set that in a separate account that is isolated, that has least privilege principles applied to them. So that way, only the people who can or should have access to that data can have access to that data. Very important. Now, if you needed to create additional trails, let's say for operational troubleshooting or for support, then you can do that without impacting the trail used for security and audit purposes. Now, event delivery. The logs can get delivered to an Amazon S3 bucket, CloudWatch logs. And you can also identify whether you want to store the logs encrypted, so you can have data at rest. Now, there's also a way for you to determine whether your logs were changed, tampered with, etc. Now, this uses a feature that runs a cryptographic validation on each file. And when it comes down to, for example, providing this audit data to your auditors, you can attest that nothing, there was no tampering of your files. Now, you can also leverage SNS notifications if you wanted to take actions, especially, let's say, on delivery of the log data, which happens at about every 5 minutes. That's also something that you can do. And we'll talk about that in more detail during the demo. Now, quick tip here is to deliver the events for all of the accounts in a central restricted access login bucket. And then one important thing here is to enable multi-factor authentication on delete. Something else that will give you an additional layer of security to make sure that the activity that is captured within your account is not either tampered with or deleted. Okay, search and analytics. You can retrieve a 90-day event history from CloudTrail via the console or the API. Now, you can narrow down to the relevant data from a time period, API operation, or even username or resource. Now, we talked about the integration before with CloudWatch logs. This will allow you to query the data within the logs for a specific type of event so that you can perform automation. You can get to the data that is within CloudTrail in a user-friendly fashion. And of course, if CloudWatch was your monitoring and observability platform at the company level, then this will allow you to standardize on the same platform. Now, CloudTrail also has integration with third-party products. So there are 20+ partner integrations for operational and security solutions. So something important to keep in mind. Okay, and then the last component that I'm going to talk about is CloudTrail Insights, which will help you identify and respond to unusual operational activity. Now, you can pick up on unexpected spikes in resource provisioning, for example. It will help you pick up on bursts of IAM management actions, is another example. You can receive custom insight events when unusual activity is detected. Now, the recommendation here is to turn on insights on your trails to save time through sifting logs and getting ahead of issues before they impact your business. So for our demo, we'll start with the CloudTrail basics, and then we'll also go into how we can get to that audit data in a simple fashion using CloudWatch logs. Okay, so now that we've talked about the various components and the various concepts of CloudTrail, let's look at the console to connect everything together. So we'll start from the CloudTrail console. Here we see that we've got some recent events. For example, we have delete bucket, which is executed by my user account. And you can view account activity in your account either via CLI or the console for up to 90 days of activity. CloudTrail will only show the results of the event history for the current region that you're viewing for the last 90 days. Now, these events are limited to management events with create, modify, and delete API calls and account activity. For a complete record of account activity, including all management events, data events, and read-only activity, you'll need to create a CloudTrail trail. So let's do that. From the console, what I will do is click View Trails. Now we can see that 2 have already been created. I'm going to create a new one. To remind you of the concept that was covered before, a trail is a configuration that enables delivery of CloudTrail events to an S3 bucket, CloudWatch logs, or CloudWatch events. There are settings within it that we'll customize that I'm going to cover shortly. Also, CloudTrail events. A CloudTrail event is a record of activity in an account. This activity can be an action taken by a user, a role, or a service that is monitorable by CloudTrail. Events provide a history of both API and non-API activity made through the AWS console, the AWS software development kits, command line tools, and other AWS services. Now, there are 2 types of events that can be logged in CloudTrail. One of them is a management event, and the other one is a data event. Now, by default, data events are not captured within trails. You have to opt in to enable that. In terms of a trail name, one recommendation that we have is to keep things simple. For example, a single trail that logs all of the management events in a region is easier to maintain over time. So when you name your trails, make sure that you name them so that they're user-friendly. For example, I'm going to name this one Logs, All Management Events in All Regions. Okay? So it is obvious what events are being tracked and from what locations. Very clear. Now, a tip that we have here is to create one audit trail that logs all events across all regions. That centralized trail can be used for security and compliance needs. And if you needed additional trails, depending on the use case that you needed it for, whether it's operations or support, then additional trails can be created. Now, the next thing to define is whether you want an organizational trail or not. Now, an organizational trail is a configuration that enables delivery of CloudTrail events in a master account and all member accounts in an organization to the same Amazon S3 bucket, the same CloudWatch logs log group, and also CloudWatch events. Creating an organizational trail helps you define a uniform event logging strategy for the entire organization. Now, for my example, I'm going to select No for whether I want to apply the trail at the entire organization. Now, the next thing to define is the type of events that you want to capture. For example, management events provide information about management operations that are performed on resources in your AWS account. These are also known as control plane operations. Some examples of these include, if you're configuring security, the IAM attach role policy API operation. Also, let's say you're setting up logging. The AWS CloudTrail create trail API operation would be considered a control plane operation. Now, management events can also include non-API events that occur in your account. For example, when a user signs into your account, CloudTrail logs the console login event. Now, this is important, especially if you're performing automation or you're analyzing events as they're coming in, because you can respond to a particular event based on your requirements. Brute force attack is one example. If you get too many console login failures, this may mean that you're getting brute force attacked from somewhere. Another important thing to keep in mind is cost. The first copy of management events is free of charge. This means that there is no additional charge for the first trail configured to capture only management events. You do pay for the S3 storage costs that are associated with storing the events, but nothing additional from a CloudTrail perspective. Any additional trails, of course, would incur additional cost. Now, the next thing to define whether you want to enable or disable is a feature called Insights. Now, if you think about the control plane operations, and if you think about the operations that write in the control plane, for example, creating an instance or run instances, for example, or create bucket. These are operations that create resources within your account. Now, Insights allows you to define a baseline for your the write operations in your account. Now, if for any reason there's behavior that creates an anomaly based on your pattern, usage pattern. So let's say that every week you create 1 and 3 bucket per week, but for some reason in one day 10 buckets get created, then you know it's something anomalous, and this will throw off the average API calls within a specific operation. Now, we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. But let's talk about data events. What are data events? So data events provide information about the resource operations performed on or in your resources. These are also known as data plane operations. Data events are often high volume activities. So it is important for you to understand the implications if you are going to enable them. Now, the following 2 data types are recorded. Amazon S3 object level API activity. So for example, get object, delete object, or put object API operations would be considered object level API activity. Now, if you think about the various compliance programs, let's say a particular bucket is within the scope of a program, one thing that you can do is you can enable privileged access audits for the data being accessed. What that gives you is that when it's time for your audit, you can take that data, give it to your auditors, and you can attest that you've got records on privileged access and who did what and when. Another type of data operation that can be captured, or events, are AWS Lambda functions. This would be execution activity from the invoke API perspective. Now, data events are disabled by default when you create a trail. To record the data events, you must explicitly add to the trail the supported resources or resource types that you want to collect activity. Very important. Now, in my case, what I will do is I'm going to forego the data events capturing, but I am going to take a look at a couple other settings. So, as I mentioned before, defining a bucket in an isolated account that is centralized to collect the logs or the data for all of your accounts is a best practice. That account is a separate security boundary. It should have separate permissions. Only the people who need to access the bucket should be able to access the bucket. So I'll define the name. Okay. And then one important thing to keep in mind is whether you want this data encrypted at rest. So what I'm going to say is, yes, I want to make sure I encrypt it, and I'm going to provide a name for the key that I'm going to use to encrypt my data. Now, the other important thing is whether you want to have integrity validation on these logs. Now, this helps you determine whether the CloudTrail log files were changed, were modified in some way, going back to your discoverability or being able to find the data for your auditors. You can present these integrity files to attest that there was no tampering with your log data. Also something very important. Okay, once that is configured, the next step is to create the trail. This is pretty fast. Great. Once we have the trail created, we do have to make sure that we send the data to CloudWatch logs. Now, to do that, what we have to do is we have to define a log group where all of this data will be sent. So in my case, we're going to send it to all management events, all regions. Okay, we're going to hit create. Now, as you would have to anytime you cross security boundaries from service to service, you have to define some permissions. You have to make sure that you're able to cross that security boundary. So we'll have to configure that as well. I will click Allow for the configuration to happen. And then within a few minutes, I will begin receiving the CloudTrail events in CloudWatch logs. Okay, we'll click Allow. Once the configuration is complete, then what we can do is we can see that the log group is defined, and we can also see that the IAM role that we used for this particular operation is also configured. Now, to start looking at the data within CloudWatch, what we will do is we'll go to the CloudWatch console. Now, from within CloudWatch, we're going to focus on one specific feature. The feature is called CloudWatch Log Insights. Now, with Log Insights, what we can do is we can get to the CloudTrail event data that is being sent to CloudWatch logs in a user-friendly fashion. Now, how do we do that? From within the CloudWatch console, we're going to select log groups, and we're going to find the log group that has all of my CloudTrail event data. Now, I had a few created. I'm going to select the one that was created prior to the one that we created during the demo, because I know that the data that I need is there. So let me select that log group. And then once I select the log group, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click View and Log Insights. Okay, so as you can see, we can query in a SQL-like language the data within CloudWatch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a specific event, and more specifically, I want to know when somebody logged onto my account, the AWS console. So I'm going to execute, and I can see that there was one login attempt, and it was successful. So I know that this particular operation completed successfully. But what about if I want to find a different operation? I can also run a query for data operation. Now, if I don't find anything, maybe I need to increase the range for when I'm looking at the data. And I'm going to increase that. And I can see that there were a few buckets deleted in my account. Okay, so now let's talk about what we learned on today's webinar. Today, we learned about the basics of AWS Config and AWS CloudTrail. We learned how configuration compliance works with AWS Config. We learned about how auditing can be simplified by AWS CloudTrail. Of course, we talked about the business benefits that both of these services provide to your company. We talked about the important use cases within the configuration, compliance, and auditing domain. So the call to action here is to take what we've learned during today's webinar, go out to your AWS console, and begin testing these various components. As you can see, and through our webinar, we gave you a step-by-step set of instructions to help you get started. Now let's move on to our question and answer section.